At my only son's wedding after raising him alone, my daughter-in-law gave me a badge that read, "Do not approach guest out of charity." My son's wealthy mother-in-law laughed at me. As I was leaving, my son received a message. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I stood outside the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel, smoothing down my navy blue dress for the third time. The fabric was from JCPenney, not designer like what everyone else would be wearing, but it was the best I could afford. At 60 years old, I had learned to make do with what I had. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the ornate doors, and my stomach twisted with a familiar anxiety I hadn't felt since Daniel was in elementary school, and I had to attend parent-teacher conferences surrounded by other mothers who seemed to have it all figured out. This was my son's wedding day. The day I had dreamed about since he was a little boy, when he would tell me he was going to marry me when he grew up. I should have been filled with joy, with pride. Instead, I felt like an intruder preparing to crash someone else's celebration. The doors opened, and a young woman in a crisp white shirt and black vest emerged. She had a clipboard in one hand and looked me up and down with barely concealed judgment. "Name?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Janet Morrison. I'm the groom's mother." She flipped through several pages, her manicured finger trailing down lists of names. My heart sank a little deeper with each page turn. Finally, she stopped and looked up at me with what I can only describe as pity mixed with disdain. "Oh yes, here you are." She reached into a small basket beside her and pulled out a name badge. Not the elegant calligraphy cards I'd seen other guests receiving, but a simple white sticker with black text. I took it from her hands and looked down. The blood drained from my face as I read the words printed in stark, cruel letters. "Do not approach guests by charity." "There must be some mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The young woman shrugged. "That's what they gave me to distribute. You'll need to wear it to enter." I stared at the badge, feeling 20 years of sacrifices, of working double shifts, of missing sleep to help with homework, of celebrating every small victory alone, crumble into dust. My hands began to shake. Who requested this?" "The bride, ma'am. Mrs. Abigail Morrison now, I suppose." The name hit me like a physical blow. Abigail. The woman who had swept into my son's life 2 years ago like a hurricane, beautiful and polished in everything I had never been able to give him. The woman who came from money, whose parents owned half the businesses in the city, who had never worked a day in her life but somehow made Daniel believe she was more sophisticated, more worldly, more worthy than the mother who had raised him. I pressed the badge against my chest, feeling the adhesive backing stick to my trembling fingers. Through the glass doors I could see the reception in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white silk. Flowers that probably cost more than my monthly rent decorated every surface. And there, in the center of it all, was my Daniel in his black tuxedo, looking more handsome than I had ever seen him. He was laughing at something a tall, elegant woman was saying. Margaret Hamilton Cross, Abigail's mother. A woman who had made it clear from the moment we met that she considered my son beneath her daughter's station, despite his success as an engineer. A woman who had somehow convinced my boy that his upbringing was something to be ashamed of. As I watched, Margaret leaned closer to Daniel, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the light. She whispered something in his ear, and they both turned to look toward the entrance. Toward me. Margaret's lips curved into what could generously be called a smile. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but he didn't wave. He didn't motion for me to come in. He simply looked away. I had raised that boy from the time he was 6 months old. His father, Thomas, had walked out when Daniel got colic and the crying became too much for him to handle. "I didn't sign up for this," he had said, packing his bags while our baby screamed in his crib. "I need someone who can handle this better than you can." So I handled it. I handled the sleepless nights, the ear infections, the scraped knees, and the broken hearts. I handled working at the diner during the day and cleaning offices at night so I could afford his soccer cleats and his class trips. I handled being the only single mother at every school event, every birthday party, every graduation. And now, on the most important day of his life, I was wearing a badge that labeled me as charity. The doors opened again and more guests streamed past me. Women in designer gowns and men in expensive suits, all of them belonging to a world I had never been part of. Some of them glanced at my badge and quickly looked away. Others whispered to their companions, and I heard fragments of their conversations. "That's the groom's mother? I heard she was quite young when she had him. Margaret says she's been a burden on the family." Each word was like a needle in my heart. I wanted to scream that I had never been a burden, that I had never asked Daniel for anything except love, that every sacrifice had been willing, every hardship endured with gratitude because I had him. But I couldn't find my voice. I could only stand there, clutching that horrible badge, watching my son's new life unfold without me. A hand touched my shoulder, and I turned to see a waiter offering me a glass of champagne from a silver tray. "Congratulations," he said kindly. "You must be so proud." I took the glass with shaking hands, not trusting myself to speak. Proud. Yes, I was proud. Proud of the man Daniel had become. Proud of his achievements, proud that he had found love. But in this moment, surrounded by wealth and elegance I could never provide, wearing a badge that branded me as unwanted, pride felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I looked through the glass doors one more time. Daniel was dancing with his new bride now, spinning her around the polished floor while everyone watched and applauded. Abigail's dress probably cost more than I made in 6 months, but she looked radiant, perfect, everything a bride should be. And Daniel looked happy. Genuinely, completely happy in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. Maybe that was worth my humiliation. Maybe my son's happiness was worth being labeled as charity, worth being pushed to the margins of the most important day of his life. I peeled the backing off the name badge and pressed it against my dress, right over my heart. The adhesive was cold against the fabric, like ice against my skin. Then I walked through those doors alone. I found myself seated at table 23, in the far corner of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a decorative pillar. The other guests at my table were distant relatives of the Hamilton Cross family, people who clearly didn't know who I was and showed no interest in finding out. They spoke over me, around me, through me, as if the badge on my chest had rendered me invisible. As I picked at the 7-course meal that tasted like sawdust in my mouth, my mind drifted back to the early days, when it was just Daniel and me against the world. Those memories felt so vivid now, sharper than the crystal glasses and polished silverware surrounding me. Daniel was 18 months old when I realized Thomas wasn't coming back. I had been waiting for 6 months, thinking maybe he just needed time to adjust to fatherhood, maybe he would miss us enough to return. But the divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered while Daniel was having his breakfast of mashed bananas and Cheerios. I remember sitting at our tiny kitchen table, reading through the legal documents while my baby boy babbled happily in his high chair, completely unaware that his father had officially abandoned him. Thomas wanted nothing. No custody, no visitation rights, no responsibility. He just wanted out. That night, after I put Daniel to bed in his crib, I sat on the floor of our 1-bedroom apartment and cried until I had no tears left. I was 22 years old, with a high school education and no family to help me. My parents had disowned me when I got pregnant unmarried, calling me a disgrace to their good Christian name. I had exactly $347 in my checking account and no idea how I was going to raise a child alone. But I did it. I got a job waitressing at Murphy's Diner, where the owner, Mrs. Murphy, let me bring Daniel with me during the slow afternoon shifts. He would sleep in a basket behind the counter while I served coffee and pie to truck drivers and construction workers. The tips weren't much, but they kept us fed. When Daniel turned 2, Mrs. Murphy couldn't let me bring him anymore. He was too active, too curious, getting into everything. So I found a babysitter, Mrs. Chan, who charged $15 a day to watch him in her apartment that smelled like cabbage and incense. It was money I couldn't afford, but I had no choice. I remember one particular evening when Daniel was 3. I had worked a double shift at the diner, then cleaned offices until 2 in the morning. I came home exhausted, my feet aching, my uniform stained with coffee and ketchup. Daniel was asleep on Mrs. Chen's couch, his little face peaceful, his hand clutched around a worn teddy bear I had bought him at a garage sale. As I carried him home through the empty streets, he stirred in my arms and looked up at me with those big brown eyes. "Mama tired?" he asked in his sweet little voice. "A little bit, baby," I whispered. He wrapped his small arms around my neck and said, "I love you, Mama. You're the best mama ever." In that moment, walking through the darkness with my son in my arms, I felt richer than any person in this ballroom ever had. The years that followed were a constant juggling act. When Daniel started school, I worked mornings at the diner and evenings cleaning the local bank. I would help him with his homework at the kitchen table after my shifts, both of us yawning over his math worksheets. When he played Little League, I was the only mother who showed up in a uniform, having rushed from work with grass stains on my knees and my hair in a messy ponytail. But I was there. For every game, every school play, every parent-teacher conference, I was there. Daniel was 8 when he first asked me why he didn't have a daddy like the other kids. We were making dinner together, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup from a can, when the question came out of nowhere. Some families are different, sweetheart. I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. We have each other, and that's what matters. But don't you get lonely, Mama? The question broke my heart because the answer was yes. I was desperately lonely. I was 28 years old, working 2 jobs with no friends and no time for romance. But I smiled at my beautiful boy and said, "How can I be lonely when I have you?" He seemed satisfied with that answer, and we never talked about it again. When Daniel was 12, he got sick with pneumonia. I stayed home from both jobs for a week, sleeping on the floor next to his bed, monitoring his fever, making sure he took his medication. We couldn't afford for me to miss work, but I couldn't afford to lose him either. Mrs. Murphy fired me. She said she understood, but she needed reliable employees. I begged her to give me another chance, but her mind was made up. I found work at a factory, packing boxes on an assembly line. The pay was slightly better, but the hours were longer, and I came home every night with my hands raw and my back screaming. Daniel started cooking dinner for us during those months. Simple things like spaghetti with butter or scrambled eggs, but he was so proud to help. He would have everything ready when I walked through the door, and we would eat together while he told me about his day at school. "You work so hard, Mama," he said one evening. "When I grow up, I'm going to make lots of money and buy you a big house. You don't need to take care of me, baby," I told him. "Just be happy. That's all I want." High school brought new challenges. Daniel was brilliant, always at the top of his class, but he needed things I couldn't provide. A computer for his projects, new clothes that fit properly, money for school activities. I took on a 3rd job, cleaning houses on weekends so he could have what the other kids had. The night of his high school graduation, I sat in the auditorium wearing my best dress, a navy blue one I had bought at a thrift store, and altered myself. When they called Daniel's name as valedictorian, I cried. Not just tears, but deep body-shaking sobs of pride and exhaustion and overwhelming love. After the ceremony, Daniel found me in the crowd. He was 18 years old, tall and handsome, and everything I had hoped he would become. He pulled me into his arms and said, "I did it, Mama. We did it." "No, sweetheart," I whispered into his ear. "You did it. I'm so proud of you." College was the hardest time of all. Daniel earned a full scholarship to study engineering, but he still needed money for books, for food, for the 1,000 little expenses that came with higher education. I sold my car and took the bus to work. I moved to a smaller apartment. I lived on ramen noodles and generic cereal so I could send him $50 here and there. He called me every week during those 4 years. Long conversations about his classes, his friends, his dreams for the future. He never asked for money, but I always found ways to send it anyway. Sometimes it meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and walking to work in the rain. But hearing the excitement in his voice when he talked about his studies made every sacrifice worth it. When Daniel graduated with honors, I was there in the front row, clapping until my hands hurt. He had done it. My little boy, the baby I had raised alone in that tiny apartment, had become an engineer. "I love you, Mama," he said when he hugged me after the ceremony. "Thank you for everything." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me, with pure, uncomplicated love. Because 2 months later, he met Abigail Hamilton Cross at a company party, and everything changed. 3 days after the wedding, I was still wearing the same pajamas I had put on when I came home from the reception. The badge with those horrible words was sitting on my kitchen counter, a constant reminder of my humiliation. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't bear to look at it either. I had called in sick to both my jobs. At 60, I was working part-time at a grocery store and cleaning office buildings at night. It wasn't much, but it kept me busy and helped pay the bills. Now, sitting in my small apartment, I felt like I was drowning in silence. Daniel hadn't called. Not once. I kept picking up my phone to dial his number, then setting it back down. What would I say? How could I explain the hurt that felt like a physical weight in my chest? How could I tell my son that the woman he had married had stripped away every last piece of my dignity? The phone rang at exactly 11:47 on Wednesday morning. I almost didn't answer it, assuming it was someone from work checking on me. But something made me pick up on the fourth ring. Mrs. Morrison? Mrs. Janet Morrison. The voice was formal, professional, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Yes, this is Janet Morrison. My name is Robert Ashford, and I'm an attorney with Ashford, Miller & Associates in Boston. I've been trying to locate you for several months now regarding your late father, William Patrick Morrison. I felt my breath catch. My father. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over 40 years. I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake, I said slowly. My father died when I was very young. There's nothing. Mrs. Morrison, I understand this must come as a shock. Your father passed away 18 months ago, and there are matters regarding his estate that require your immediate attention. I sank into my kitchen chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. I don't understand. My father abandoned us when I was 5 years old. My mother told me he died. I'm afraid that wasn't accurate, ma'am. Your father spent many years trying to locate you and your mother. When he hired me 10 years ago, he was quite ill and very determined to find his family before he passed. The words felt surreal, like I was listening to someone else's conversation. He was looking for us? Yes, ma'am. There's quite a bit to explain, and I think it would be best if we could meet in person. Are you able to travel to Boston, or would you prefer that I come to you? I looked around my tiny apartment, with its second-hand furniture and peeling wallpaper. The idea of a Boston lawyer coming here felt impossible. I don't have the money to travel right now. Mrs. Morrison, please don't concern yourself with expenses. This matter involves a significant estate, and all travel costs will be covered. Would this Friday work for you? Significant estate. The words bounced around in my head like marbles in a jar. I had never owned anything significant in my entire life. Mr. Ashford, I think you might have the wrong person. I work at a grocery store. I live in a one-bedroom apartment. I don't have estates or lawyers or... Ma'am, he interrupted gently, your father was William Patrick Morrison, born in Dublin, Ireland in 1928. He married your mother, Catherine Rose Sullivan, in Boston in 1953. You were born Janet Rose Morrison on March 15, 1963. Is this correct? My mother's maiden name. My exact birth date. Details I had never shared with anyone except Daniel, and the necessary forms for work and medical care. How do you know all of this? Your father spent considerable resources tracking down these details, Mrs. Morrison. He never stopped looking for you. I felt tears starting to form, but I pushed them back. I had cried enough in the last few days to last a lifetime. What happened to him? Why did he leave us? That's a conversation best had in person, Mrs. Morrison. What I can tell you is that your father built a successful construction business here in Boston. When he passed, he left specific instructions that his entire estate should go to you, provided we could locate you. His entire estate? Yes, ma'am. Including a commercial property in downtown Boston that's currently valued at approximately $2.8 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. I dropped the phone and it clattered onto the kitchen floor. $2.8 million. I had never even seen that much money written on a check, let alone imagined owning it. I scrambled to pick up the phone. Mr. Ashford? Are you still there? Yes, Mrs. Morrison. I understand this is overwhelming. There has to be a mistake. My father. He left us with nothing. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. We lived in subsidized housing until I was 18. If he had money, if he had a business. Mrs. Morrison, I think there are things about your father's departure that you may not fully understand. Your mother may have had her reasons for telling you what she did, but the man I knew spent decades searching for his family. I closed my eyes, trying to process what I was hearing. If this was real, if my father had actually been looking for us all these years, then everything I thought I knew about my childhood was wrong. Everything my mother had told me about being abandoned was a lie. The property, I said finally. What kind of property? It's a 4-story building in the financial district. Your father's construction company occupied the first 2 floors, and the upper floors are leased to various businesses. The rental income alone generates approximately $30,000 per month. $30,000 per month. I made less than that in an entire year at both my jobs combined. Mrs. Morrison, there's something else you should know. Your father left detailed letters explaining his side of the story. He wanted you to understand what really happened when you were a child. I thought about my mother, who had died 10 years ago after a long battle with cancer. She had gone to her grave insisting that my father was a worthless man who had abandoned his family without a second thought. She had worked herself into an early grave, bitter and angry and convinced that she had been betrayed by the one person who should have protected her. What if she had been wrong? What if my father had been trying to find us all along? Mr. Ashford, if I come to Boston, what happens next? You'll inherit everything, Mrs. Morrison. The property, the business assets, and a considerable amount of cash that your father had set aside specifically for you and any family you might have. Family? Daniel. My son who had just gotten married, who was building a life with a woman who saw me as nothing more than an embarrassment. My son who had stood by and watched me be humiliated at his wedding. How soon can I come? I can have a plane ticket waiting for you at the airport within 2 hours. Would you be able to fly out today? I looked around my apartment again, at the life I had built from nothing, sustained by determination and love and endless sacrifice. In just a few minutes, a single phone call had changed everything. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. I'll be ready. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at that horrible badge on the counter. Guess by Charity. The woman who had written those words had no idea that she had just labeled a millionaire as Charity. For the first time in 3 days I smiled. The flight to Boston was the first time I had ever traveled anywhere by plane. As I sat in the first-class seat that Mr. Ashford had arranged, sipping orange juice from actual glassware, I kept expecting someone to tell me there had been a mistake, that I belonged in the back of the plane with the cramped seats and no legroom, not up here with the business travelers in their expensive suits. Mr. Ashford met me at Logan Airport, and I recognized him immediately despite having never seen him before. He had the bearing of a man who spent his days in courtrooms and boardrooms, but his eyes were kind when he shook my hand. Mrs. Morrison, thank you for coming so quickly. I know this must all seem very sudden. He was younger than I had expected, maybe 50, with graying hair and a gentle Boston accent. As we rode in his car through the city, he pointed out landmarks and made small talk, but I could see him glancing at me in the rearview mirror, as if trying to gauge how I was handling everything. His office was in a building that looked like it belonged in a movie about important lawyers. Wood paneling, leather-bound books, windows that looked out over Boston Harbor. He offered me coffee or tea, and I accepted coffee, more because my hands needed something to hold than because I was thirsty. Mrs. Morrison, before we discuss the estate, I think it's important that you understand what really happened when you were a child. Your father left very detailed instructions about what I should tell you. He opened a thick folder and pulled out a letter written in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow found familiar. This is in your father's words, Mrs. Morrison. He wrote it specifically for you. I took the letter with trembling hands. The paper was expensive, cream-colored, with my name written across the top in careful script. My dearest Janet, it began. If you are reading this, then Robert has found you, and I have finally been able to reach across the years to tell you the truth about what happened when you were 5 years old. Asterisk, I did not abandon you and your mother. I was forced to leave Boston by circumstances that I pray you will never have to understand. Asterisk. Asterisk, your mother's brother, Patrick Sullivan, was involved with very dangerous people. He had borrowed money from men who collected their debts with violence, and when he couldn't pay, they came looking for our family. They threatened your mother, and they threatened you specifically. They said that if Patrick didn't pay within a week, they would hurt his sister's little girl to send a message. Asterisk. Asterisk, I went to Patrick and demanded that he solve the problem, but he had already disappeared. Left town without telling anyone where he was going, leaving his family to face the consequences of his choices. Asterisk. Asterisk the men came to our house on a Tuesday night. You were sleeping upstairs, and your mother was doing dishes in the kitchen. They told me that I had to choose. I could pay Patrick's debt of $50,000, money we didn't have, or I could leave town and never contact my family again. If I stayed, if I tried to fight them or go to the police, they would hurt you. Asterisk. Asterisk I had exactly $1,300 in our savings account. I begged them to give me time to get the money, but they said the only way to guarantee your safety was for me to disappear completely. They would be watching, they said. If I ever tried to contact you or your mother, if I ever came back to Boston, they would know. Asterisk. Asterisk so I left. I took nothing but the clothes on my back and that $1,300, and I drove west until I couldn't drive anymore. I ended up in Chicago where I started over with nothing. Asterisk. Asterisk I want you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I have ever done. Every day for 40 years I have thought about you. I have wondered what you looked like, what you enjoyed doing, whether you were happy. I hired investigators starting in 1975, as soon as I had enough money saved up, but your mother had changed both your names and moved several times. The trail went cold. Asterisk. Asterisk it wasn't until 2010 that I finally found evidence that you were living in Ohio. By then I was already sick, and I knew I didn't have much time left. I wanted to contact you immediately, but Robert convinced me to be careful. He said that suddenly appearing in your life after all these years might do more harm than good. Asterisk. Asterisk so I decided to wait, to make sure that when I found you, I could offer you something more than just apologies and explanations. I wanted to give you security, the kind of life I had always dreamed of providing for you. Asterisk. Asterisk the construction business grew beyond anything I had ever imagined. I worked 16-hour days for 30 years not because I loved the work, but because every dollar I earned was a dollar I could someday give to you. Every building I constructed was built with the hope that it would help secure your future. Asterisk. Asterisk I know that money cannot make up for a lifetime of absence. I know that nothing can give you back the father you deserve to have during your childhood, your teenage years, your young adulthood. But I hope that this inheritance can at least provide you with choices you might not have had otherwise. Asterisk. Asterisk I also hope that you can find it in your heart to forgive your mother for the lies she told you about me. When I disappeared, she had to explain my absence somehow. Telling you that I was a deadbeat who abandoned his family was probably easier than telling you the truth about the danger we were all in. She was protecting you the only way she knew how. Asterisk. Asterisk I love you, Janet. I have loved you every single day since the morning I kissed your forehead and told you I was going to work, not knowing it would be the last time I would ever see you. Asterisk. Your father. William Patrick Morrison. I set the letter down on Mr. Ashford's desk and stared out the window at the harbor. A lifetime of anger and resentment was crumbling inside me, replaced by a grief so profound it felt like drowning. He really spent all those years looking for me? Every resource he had, Mrs. Morrison. When he got sick, finding you became his obsession. He used to call me every week asking for updates on the search. Why didn't he try to contact me once you found me? Why did he wait until after he died? Mr. Ashford leaned forward, his expression serious. He was afraid, Mrs. Morrison. Afraid that you would reject him, that you would be angry, that his presence in your life would cause more pain than healing. He thought that leaving you the inheritance would be a way of showing his love, without forcing you to confront decades of hurt. I thought about my mother, who had worked herself to death believing she had been abandoned. She had carried that bitterness for her entire life, and it had shaped everything about how she raised me. The distrust of men, the belief that people would always let you down, the fierce independence that she had passed on to me. The men who threatened us, I said. What happened to them? Your father hired investigators to track that down too. Patrick Sullivan was found dead in Detroit in 1973. The men who were after him were arrested for various crimes over the years. They're all either dead or in prison now. So he could have come back. Not until the late 1980s when the last of them was imprisoned. By then you were already an adult, and he had no way of knowing whether contact would be welcome. I picked up the letter again, reading certain passages over. Every building I constructed was built with the hope that it would help secure your future. Mr. Ashford, what exactly am I inheriting? He smiled for the first time since I had arrived. Mrs. Morrison, your father was a very successful businessman. The property I mentioned on the phone is just the beginning. He opened another folder and spread out documents across his desk. Bank statements, property deeds, stock certificates, investment portfolios. The total value of the estate is approximately $4.2 million. That includes the commercial building, several smaller properties around Boston, a diversified investment portfolio, and nearly $800,000 in cash. $4.2 million. I had been worried about paying for groceries next week, and now I was looking at more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. There's one more thing, Mr. Ashford said, reaching into his desk drawer. Your father left specific instructions that if we found you, you should have this immediately. He handed me a small jewelry box. Inside was a simple gold necklace with a heart-shaped locket. I opened the locket and found a tiny photograph of myself as a child, probably taken when I was 4 or 5 years old. On the other side was an inscription. My heart goes with you always. Daddy. I closed the locket and fastened it around my neck, feeling the weight of it against my chest. For the first time in 3 days, since that horrible moment at Daniel's wedding, I felt like I mattered to someone. What happens now? I asked. Now, Mrs. Morrison, you get to decide what kind of life you want to live. I spent 2 weeks in Boston, learning about my father's business and making arrangements to sell some of the properties. Mr. Ashford introduced me to financial advisors and accountants, people who spoke in numbers that still didn't feel real. But the weight of my father's locket around my neck reminded me constantly that this was happening, that my life had fundamentally changed. During those 2 weeks, Daniel called me exactly once. Mom, where are you? I stopped by your apartment and talked to Mrs. Rodriguez. She said you haven't been home. His voice sounded irritated, like I had inconvenienced him by disappearing. Not worried, not concerned. Irritated. I'm in Boston, sweetheart. Taking care of some family business. Family business? What family business? And why didn't you tell me you were leaving town? I almost laughed at the irony. He was asking me why I hadn't told him I was leaving town, 3 days after his wedding, where his wife had labeled me as charity and he had said nothing. It's complicated, Daniel. I'll explain when I get back. Mom, are you okay? You sound different. Different? Yes, I supposed I did sound different. I felt different. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about money. I wasn't calculating whether I could afford groceries and rent in the same month. I wasn't exhausted from working multiple jobs just to survive. I'm fine, honey. How was your honeymoon? It was great. Abigail loved the resort. Listen, when you get back, we need to talk. About the wedding, about some things that happened. Finally, an acknowledgement that something had happened at his wedding. That his mother had been humiliated, and he had done nothing to stop it. Yes, I said calmly. We definitely need to talk. When I returned home 3 weeks after that phone call from Mr. Ashford, I didn't go back to my apartment immediately. Instead, I checked into the nicest hotel in town, the Grand Regency, where Daniel and Abigail had held their engagement party 6 months earlier. The same hotel where I had felt so out of place that I had left early, claiming I had a headache. I booked the penthouse suite for a week. Not because I needed that much space, but because I wanted to experience what it felt like to not worry about the cost of anything. The suite was larger than my entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city, and there was a marble bathroom with a tub big enough for 2 people. I ordered room service for dinner and ate salmon that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. That evening, I called Daniel from the hotel phone. Mom? The caller ID says you're at the Grand Regency. Why are you calling me from a hotel? Because I'm staying here for a few days. Can you and Abigail meet me for dinner tomorrow night? 7 o'clock in the hotel restaurant. You're staying at the Grand Regency? Mom, that place costs a fortune. You can't afford. Yes, I can, I interrupted. 7 o'clock, Daniel. Just you and Abigail. We have things to discuss. There was a long pause. Okay, but Mom, what's going on? You're acting really strange. I'll see you tomorrow night. I hung up before he could ask any more questions. The next evening, I dressed carefully. I had bought new clothes during my time in Boston, expensive ones that fit properly and made me feel confident. I chose a black dress that was simple but elegant, and I wore my father's locket prominently over my heart. I was already seated in the restaurant when Daniel and Abigail arrived. I watched them through the large windows as they walked through the hotel lobby. Daniel looked confused and a little worried. Abigail looked annoyed, as if this dinner was an inconvenience she was being forced to endure. The hostess led them to my table, and I stood to greet them. Daniel hugged me, but it felt perfunctory, obligatory. Abigail offered a thin smile and sat down without any greeting at all. "Mom, you look different," Daniel said, studying my face. "And this place? How are you paying for this?" "Before we discuss anything else," I said, looking directly at Abigail, "I think we need to address what happened at your wedding." Abigail's smile became even thinner. "Oh, you mean that little misunderstanding with the name tag? Janet, that was just a mix-up with the wedding planner. These things happen at big events." I reached into my purse and pulled out the badge, placing it on the white tablecloth between us. The black letters stood out starkly against the pristine fabric. "Do not approach guests by charity." "This was not a mix-up," I said quietly. "This was deliberate, and we all know it." Daniel picked up the badge, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Abigail, what is this?" "It's nothing, darling. Like I said, just a misunderstanding." "No," I said, my voice still calm but firmer now. "It's exactly what it appears to be. Your wife instructed the wedding staff to label me as charity, to make sure everyone at your reception knew that I didn't belong there." Abigail's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw a flash of the cruelty that had been hiding behind her perfect smile. "Well, Janet, let's be honest. You were there because Daniel insisted, not because you actually fit in with our families. I was just being realistic." Daniel set the badge down carefully, his jaw tightening. "Abigail, how could you do this to my mother?" "Oh, please," Abigail said, waving her hand dismissively. "Your mother has been playing the martyr for years. Poor single mother, worked so hard, sacrificed so much. We've all heard the story 1,000 times." I felt a familiar stab of pain at her words, but this time it was different. This time, I wasn't the desperate woman who had to accept whatever crumbs of respect my son's family was willing to give me. "You're right," I said, surprising them both. "I did work hard. I did sacrifice. And I did it all for him." I looked at Daniel, who was staring at the badge as if seeing it for the first time. "But what you don't understand, Abigail, is that those sacrifices weren't weaknesses. They were investments." "Investments?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "In what? You work at a grocery store and clean offices. What could you possibly have invested in?" I reached into my purse again and pulled out a folder. From it, I extracted a bank statement that Mr. Ashford had prepared for me, showing my current account balance. I placed it next to the name badge. Abigail glanced at it casually, then her eyes widened. She picked up the paper, studying the numbers. This can't be right," she said, her voice losing its confident edge. Daniel leaned over to look at the statement. "Mom, what is this?" "That's my current bank balance," I said simply. $4.2 million. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the quiet conversations from other tables, the clinking of silverware, the soft music playing in the background. But at our table no one spoke. Finally, Daniel found his voice. "How is this possible?" I told them about the phone call from Mr. Ashford, about my father's letter, about the inheritance that had changed everything. As I spoke, I watched their faces carefully. Daniel looked stunned, confused, trying to process this information about the grandmother he had never known existed. Abigail looked calculating. "So your father, who abandoned you as a child, left you money?" she said when I finished. "How convenient." "He didn't abandon me," I said firmly. "He was forced to leave to protect me and my mother. He spent 40 years looking for us." "That's a lovely story, Janet, but people say a lot of things in letters. Dead people can't be questioned about their claims." I had expected this response from her, the automatic dismissal, the need to minimize anything that might elevate my status in her world. "You're right," I said. "Dead people can't be questioned, but their lawyers can provide documentation, and their business records can be verified. Would you like to see the property deeds? The investment portfolios?" For the first time since I had known her, Abigail looked uncertain. Daniel was still staring at the bank statement. "Mom, why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" Because I wanted to understand what it meant first. And because I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I was still just the poor woman who embarrassed you at your wedding. He flinched as if I had slapped him. Mom, I never. You stood there and watched your wife humiliate me, and you said nothing. You let me wear that badge and sit alone at a table in the corner, while your new family laughed about the charity case. I didn't know about the badge, he said weakly. But you knew I was being treated poorly, and you chose to do nothing because it was easier than confronting them. Abigail had recovered her composure somewhat. Well, this changes things, doesn't it? Janet, I hope you know that what happened at the wedding was really just a misunderstanding. We're family now, and family should support each other. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had spent 2 years making it clear that I was beneath her consideration, who had just minutes ago dismissed my life's sacrifices as martyrdom. No, I said quietly. We're not family. Family doesn't humiliate each other. Family doesn't label each other as charity. I stood up, leaving the bank statement and the name badge on the table between them. I'm staying in this hotel for 3 more days, I told Daniel. If you want to have a real conversation about our relationship, about respect, about what it means to be family, you know where to find me. But if you come alone. Daniel came to see me on the 3rd day. Just as I was preparing to check out of the hotel, I was packing my new clothes into a suitcase that didn't have duct tape holding it together when I heard the soft knock on the door. He stood in the hallway looking like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. Can I come in, Mom? I stepped aside to let him enter. He walked to the large windows overlooking the city and stood there for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back. It was a gesture I remembered from when he was a little boy, something he did when he was trying to find the courage to tell me something difficult. Abigail and I had a fight, he said without turning around. A big one. I continued packing, waiting for him to find his words. She said some things about you that I can't forgive. Things about how you raised me, about the sacrifices you made. She called them manipulation. Said you were just playing the victim to make me feel guilty. I folded a blouse carefully, taking my time with the creases. What did you say? I told her she was wrong. That you never asked me for anything. Never made me feel guilty for your choices. That everything you did was out of love. He turned to face me and I could see tears in his eyes. But then I realized something worse, Mom. I realized that even though I defended you to her, I had been letting her treat you badly for 2 years. I had been embarrassed by you, ashamed of where I came from, and I let her make you feel small because it was easier than standing up to her. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap. This was the conversation I had been waiting for. But now that it was happening, I felt oddly calm. Why, Daniel? Why was it easier to let her hurt me than to defend me? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration I remembered from his teenage years. Because she made me feel like I was worth something, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Her family, their money, their status. It made me feel like I had finally made it, like I wasn't just the kid who grew up poor with a single mom. The words cut deep, but I had expected them. I had seen it happening gradually over the 2 years since he had met Abigail. The way he started correcting his grammar more carefully, the way he stopped mentioning our small apartment or my jobs, the way he seemed to shrink a little whenever I was around his new friends. I was never ashamed of you, Mom. I want you to know that. But I was ashamed of being poor, of not having the same advantages as other people. And Abigail's family made me feel like I could leave all of that behind. But you can't leave it behind, Daniel, I said gently. That poverty, those struggles, they're part of who you are. They're part of what made you strong enough to earn that scholarship. Smart enough to become an engineer, determined enough to succeed. He nodded, tears flowing freely now. I know that now. When Abigail was saying those horrible things about you, about us, I realized that she doesn't love me. She loves the version of me that exists in her world. The one with no history, no family, no complications. I stood up and walked to where he was standing by the window. For a moment we both looked out at the city where I had raised him, where we had struggled together, where we had celebrated his victories and weathered his disappointments. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know, he admitted. The marriage. I don't think it can work. Not when she has so much contempt for the most important person in my life. I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling how thin he had become. Don't make any decisions based on me, Daniel. Make them based on what you need to be happy, to be yourself. She's pregnant, Mom. The words hit me like a physical blow. A grandchild. Something I had dreamed about for years, imagined in quiet moments when I wondered what kind of grandfather Daniel would make, what kind of grandmother I would be. Are you sure? She told me yesterday after our fight. She said now we have to make the marriage work, that we owe it to the baby. I felt my heart breaking for him, for the impossible situation he was in, for the child who would be born into this tension and conflict. What do you want to do? I want to be a good father, he said immediately. Better than my father was. I want to be there for my child no matter what happens between Abigail and me. Then that's what you'll do, I said simply. He turned to look at me, surprise in his eyes. You're not going to tell me to leave her? After everything she's done to you. Daniel, I raised you to be a man who takes responsibility for his actions, who honors his commitments, who protects the people who depend on him. If you have a child with Abigail, then that child needs you to be the best father you can be, regardless of what happens with your marriage. But what about you? How can I ask you to be around her, to be a grandmother to her child, after what she's done? I smiled, touching the locket at my throat. Sweetheart, I've just learned that my own father spent 40 years loving me from a distance, trying to take care of me in the only way he could. I understand now that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Over the next 6 months, I watched my son navigate the complicated reality of his situation. He and Abigail stayed married, but they went to counseling, and slowly, very slowly, she began to understand that her behavior toward me had been unacceptable. I didn't make it easy for her. I no longer pretended to be grateful for the smallest gestures of politeness. I didn't laugh at jokes that weren't funny or accept treatment that was less than respectful. My financial independence had given me something more valuable than money, the freedom to demand dignity. When my granddaughter was born, I was in the delivery room holding Daniel's hand while he held Abigail's. The baby was perfect, tiny and red-faced and absolutely beautiful. When the nurse placed her in my arms for the first time, I looked down at her perfect little face and felt my heart expand in ways I had forgotten were possible. What's her name? I asked. Daniel looked at Abigail, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Catherine Rose, he said. After her great-grandmother. I looked up at him, surprised. My mother's name. The woman who had raised me with bitterness and anger, but who had also protected me and loved me in the only way she knew how. And her middle name, Abigail said quietly, is Janet, after her grandmother who sacrificed everything to raise the most wonderful man I know. It wasn't a complete transformation. Abigail and I would never be close friends, and Margaret still looked at me with barely concealed disdain at family gatherings. But there was respect now, an acknowledgement that I belonged in this family not as Charity, but as the woman who had raised their son and husband. I sold my father's business and most of his properties, keeping only the building in Boston as an investment. With the money, I bought a small house near Daniel and Abigail, close enough to help with the baby but far enough to maintain my independence. I quit both my jobs and enrolled in college for the first time in my life. At 61, I was finally pursuing the education I had always wanted but never been able to afford. I studied literature and history, subjects that had nothing to do with earning money and everything to do with feeding my soul. On weekends, I babysit little Catherine while Daniel and Abigail work on their marriage. She's walking now, taking those wobbly first steps that remind me so much of when Daniel was learning to walk in our tiny apartment. Sometimes when I'm holding her, I think about my father and all the years we lost. I think about the letters he wrote that I never received, the birthdays he missed, the conversations we never had. But mostly, I think about how love finds a way to survive even when everything else falls apart. I wear his locket every day, and sometimes Catherine reaches for it with her tiny fingers, fascinated by the way it catches the light. When she's older, I'll tell her about her great-grandfather, about how love can span decades and survive separation, and find its way home even when all hope seems lost. I'll tell her about the badge that labeled me as Charity, and how it taught me that other people's words don't define our worth. I'll tell her about the importance of dignity, of standing up for yourself, of never accepting less than you deserve. But mostly, I'll tell her that she is loved unconditionally, completely. The way every child deserves to be loved. The way I loved her father. The way my father loved me. The way love travels through generations like a river that never stops flowing. I'm not the same woman who stood outside that ballroom 3 years ago, afraid to enter my own son's wedding reception. I'm stronger now, more confident, more certain of my place in the world. And when people ask me how my life changed so dramatically, I tell them the truth. Sometimes the universe has a way of giving you exactly what you need, exactly when you're ready to receive it. Sometimes charity comes to those who have been giving it all along.